Thank you very much for coming back. Let's get started. The next speaker, panelist is Mr. Shiro Takegami, Director General, Technology Strategy Center, NEDO, Japan. So Takegami-san, please.
Thank you very much for introduction. My name is Shiro Takegami, that from the organization of we call it NEDO, New Energy and Development Organization. And NEDO is, it's not so familiar to you, that's just a short, brief introduction. Next slide, please. That's NEDO is the public funding agency under the Ministry of Economy. And so especially for the research and activity, almost 1.5 billion yen, US dollars every year, spending for the industry sectors to the conducting research and and innovation activities since 1980. So the more than 30, more than 40 years that we have experience, especially for the environment and energy and industrial technologies. Next slide, please. And that's the NEDO. That's the we have the Technology Strategy Center. I belong to the. I am the Deputy Director General of the TSC, Technology Strategy Center, and this center is established 2008, more than 5 years ago, and conducting this technology strategy, more than 40 strategies we already that established. And under this strategy, we are conducting the research innovation activities using 1.5 billion US dollars. And including that, we have the 8 areas. You can see the left side of this slide. This slide is, we already copied and handouts. My colleagues already have that. Maybe that's you can get it later after my presentation. And again, that's the it's in the 8 areas. We have energy system and the hydrogen. Also, that renewable energy areas we are already covered. Because of that, we established with collaboration with the JST to the roadmaps of SDG 7. Next slide, please. This is the roadmap for SDG 7, the NEDO and the JST, another funding agency of under the Ministry of Education. Thinking about the target of the each target of the SDG 7, and we are thinking about the 3 parts of the roadmaps. One is the energy access for the global expansion, as the idea of the clean energy global network. And the second one is the renewable energy promotion. Chisan Chiso, I mean that it is this energy matter is especially for the local issues. Energy system is very important for the local areas and over the Japanese areas. And also the third one is energy saving. Energy and IoT technologies and the top runner scheme is very important for the roadmap of SDG 7. Next slide, please. Before that, starting my explanation, that's I already have received a question with 3 questions about the roadmap. One question is the reason for the facilitating the development of roadmaps. Our accumulation of the roadmap made us aware that's highlighted the core innovation by narrative. And the 3 main idea is very important. We think that's one is enhance public understanding, and also that help people and the R&D community, and also the promote cross-sector alliance is very important for the idea of this development of roadmaps. Next slide, please. Another one question is how to develop the roadmaps. We have the roadmaps established with working with the JST within almost 2 months, and to develop this roadmap, we think that's upgrading and also scale up to co-design with the stakeholders. You can see the left side of the picture You can see that the foresight and horizon scanning idea is working with the online platform, including mission identification, analysis, co-design, collaborative actions, and also that monitoring and review. This cycle is working to upgrading the roadmaps. And next slide, please. And also that's the question that the unique features of our roadmaps. The unique feature roadmap is, you can see the left side is the green one. It's thinking about the backcasting roadmaps, and also that forecasting roadmap is refraining the members' intelligence. This roadmap is upgrading by co-design and co-innovation idea with the discussion with the stakeholders, and we need the identification of the solution of these roadmaps we made. Next slide, please. This is upgrading and the scale up of STI for SDGs. This slide is a little bit busy, but you can see that within the green one is energy service, energy technologies, renewable energy, and also improving efficiency by smart grid. And surrounding this blue circle, that's the idea of the clean energy trade chain, also that investment chain, and also that clean and affordable energy supply chain. And this is kind of the a system of systems. As yesterday, Dr. Fernando mentioned about the network of networks. This is the same idea, but I think that the system of systems is a very important idea of this roadmap. This is maybe the same idea and the same scope of the network of networks, as Dr. Fernando mentions. Next slide, please. This is my final presentation scheme. As next task and plan is, I think that's the communication is to implementing for the SDGs. Next task is the involvement of the stakeholders, and also that co-design, including guidelines and capacity building. Also realization and assessment of the successful cases. I think that a common target and a common understanding is very important through the communication. It's the very important issue for this, conducting and realization of these roadmaps. So that's we plan that the collaborative action based on these roadmaps, and also that we are studying the evaluation, this roadmap framework, and so this activity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Takegami-san, that he mentioned that NEDO was established just after the oil crisis in 1970s and early 80s. And so NEDO is responsible to manage the national energy strategies. So you have any questions or comments, please?
How they are called. So what do you mean? Is this, what type of actions under this heading collaborate? I mean, my idea is, yes, it's fun, you fund projects, but what type of projects I would like to know to implement the objectives that you set in the roadmaps, right? Thanks.
Thank you for the comments and the questions. And you're right, that we just established this roadmap, so that as I mentioned, the communication and the involvement of stakeholder is very important. So that's the next step is the involvement of stakeholders, because stakeholder means that including the industrial sectors, public sectors, also that's some of the, as you mentioned, that's the actions for that's the research and innovation activities. So that's this roadmap is not done by only the inside of the Japanese community. We have to call on the international communities and related organizations to do action with the to realize these roadmaps.
Any other question?
Sorry, this was not rehearsed before. My question, it's a great example of a roadmap implemented in practice. My question is on how do you connect, because you bring together foresight exercises and the road mapping process, which often proves to be quite difficult. And I wonder, where does prioritization happen? You know, whether the priorities are already kind of prepared by the foresight process and then they are taken on by the road mapping process, or whether foresight is more really horizon scanning, preparing the ground for prioritization that takes place within the road mapping process, or whether it happens somewhere else.
Actually, that's my organization, that the TSC is conducting, making the technology strategy by forecasting and backcasting, the mixed together. So this experience that we have, that's so that making that this roadmap is mixing, forecasting, the backcasting. I think that we are specialized in these areas.
Okay.
All right. You described designing the visions and the STI roadmaps as comprehensive narratives. I'd be really interested to know, I mean, you've got a really nice diagram in your slides of the graphical representation of the roadmap. But when you say comprehensive narrative, that gives me the feeling maybe there's kind of longer texts describing what's going on in these graphics. I'd be grateful for a bit more detail about the degree of narrative detail that these comprehensive narratives go into.
Thank you very much. The detail of the roadmap is in the website of JST, and also that I think that's still that we are not well prepared for the announcing these roadmaps. So that today is a very good start for the announcement of this roadmap, SDG 7, and also that we understand we have to working not only the SDG 7, also that other SDG target areas.
It's very difficult to starting from foresight or horizon scanning, and we define the prioritized domain or pathways. But it's our desire to do like something like this. Yeah. And NEDO is leading the green economy. So please watch NEDOs.
And today, that's my colleague also attended this meeting, that he wrote this roadmap, one of the members. So that's Dr. Nakagami.
And also, NEDO has been doing a lot of proof of concept experiments in the partner countries, many places in Europe, United States, and others. So we can share this kind of roadmap together internationally.
We have international branch also, that's US and Europe. Europe in the Paris, and US is the Washington DC and the Silicon Valley, and also India and Thailand.
Okay, any other questions or comments? No? Thank you very much, Takagami-san. So let me move on to the next topic, Swedish experience with policy roadmaps. Very interesting. Mr. Fanestock, rise, please.
Thank you. I'm glad Mr. Takegami came in between because I was worried we were going to have death by Sweden today. I'm also speaking about Swedish experience, but from a slightly different perspective. In the just for the information of the group here, in the context of the inno4sd project, I've been working with Michal and Will and working on analyzing road mapping as an activity from a more analytical perspective. In my day job, I'm more of a practitioner of road mapping. I'm based at RISE, which is a government-owned polytechnic institute in Sweden, and I'm responsible for forward-looking analysis there. So I do strategic foresight with our partners and clients. I work on scenario analyses, visioning, and also road mapping, and I've done work with a number of different industries, and also with some public sector actors over the past 5 years using these methods. RISE itself has a diverse set of technically oriented competencies. We have sort of a basis in history and certification and standards development and testing of equipment. But today, I would say, at the margin of our activities, 90% of what we do is innovation for sustainable development. The reality of the Swedish economy is that our industrial partners, investments in innovation, R&D are really largely focused on more sustainable products and processes. That's the most important part of their R&D work. And for our public sector partners and clients, increasingly there's an interest in sort of system level innovation for sustainable development. So that's a lot of what we do. We are a conglomeration of a number of smaller research institutes that were merged formally in 2016. In that process of bringing together these institutes, we faced a number of challenges, as any organizational change creates. Some of these were about how the different institutes saw our role as an innovation partner, really fundamentally about what we should prioritize in the different areas we manage. And we were looking for ways to develop joint priorities across the newly created institute and fit our portfolio of projects and customers into a kind of a bigger picture. And road mapping was one of the tools we decided to use. Internally, I'm not going to present the roadmaps that we developed. I don't have any slides at all, in fact. But I wanted to share some reflections from that process of developing those roadmaps and see if maybe there's some interesting learnings that can be taken away. So over the course of 2 years, we developed 7 roadmaps. I may be forgetting some here: power and heat, transport and mobility, manufacturing and process industries, bioeconomy, and the built environment. Each area is quite broad, and we had a fairly diverse set of activities already in each of these areas, and we developed a roadmap for each of them. To do that, we engaged the researchers across our constituent institutes, and we also drew on the existing project work we had with our partners and our customers as a kind of baseline. What are the activities that are going on in the field right now? And we also set up consultation processes, including with the Swedish Energy Agency and with some of the existing strategic innovation programs that had been established by Vinnova, our national innovation agency. The purpose of the roadmaps was internal to RISE. We did not have a mandate to do this from the government in the way that Malin and Fossil Free Sweden have. We were developing our own roadmaps for our own business, our own purposes, but we were aware that there was nothing comparable already in the market, so to say. There were no existing roadmaps for sustainable innovation in Sweden, and we saw a chance to not just set an agenda for ourselves, but also to help articulate and clarify what some of Sweden's existing political goals and strategies meant in terms of innovation. What kinds of innovation activities would need to be undertaken, by whom, and over what time scale in order to meet Sweden's objectives related to sustainable development. And that's sort of a summary of what road mapping is, what needs to be done by whom and when. That's kind of what's included. In terms of what we learned in the process of developing these roadmaps, one success factor definitely was that there was this fairly clear political context, and I recognize that when Swedes come up here and present about their experience, the reaction is often spoken or unspoken. Well, that's Sweden. You know, they have those advantages. There's some truth to that, but it isn't always that way. We have been developing some clear political policy, high policy level goals that have made such work easier. Muller mentioned the cross-party agreement to reach zero emissions 2045. It's worth noting that a goal like that is very useful if it's zero. An 80% goal would have created all kinds of arguments about burden sharing and what sector has to do how much. A zero goal means everybody has to get to zero, which makes life much easier. There are also special sectoral goals for a number of sectors in Sweden, including renewable energy, transportation and fuels, and energy efficiency in buildings. So these kinds of sector level goals were really advantageous. It was noticeable in the lack also. So in certain areas like bioeconomy and in manufacturing, there weren't corresponding goals that were so clear. There is no national bioeconomy strategy, for example, despite all our forestry resources. And there is an innovation program, but there was nothing really to use as a reference point there. And those pieces of work ended up being much more challenging. Having the political guidance in the form of an accepted and established goal was really helpful. Even so, sometimes for our researchers and practitioners, it was hard to relate to broad policy objectives, to bridge from the work that was going on today to that work, and to sometimes let go of our own and our partners, our customers' own agendas for research and innovation. We brought that with us into the road mapping process, and it was a challenge to really reorient everybody's focus to the policy goals and say, okay, in order to achieve that, what do we have to do? Don't think too much about what we have in our backpack at the moment. Think about what we need to have when we get to the end of the journey. That was challenging. I think it's an important learning for road mapping in general, that if your roadmap is being used to justify what you're doing already, you might as well not do it. Having reviewed some roadmaps in the course of this project, that's not uncommon. A number of roadmaps are really ways to justify status quo. I think that's particularly risky when it's industry or research leading the roadmap. We have obviously a bias towards decisions already taken, especially when those decisions involved allocating money. So I think that's a big challenge, something to be aware of when working with roadmaps. On the other hand, we did have the advantage of being able to take the policy environment and the policy goals as a given. We're not involved in the formulation in any particularly significant way anyway, and we could focus on deriving actions for ourselves from the policy goals and not arguing for one policy or another. I think in roadmaps that are produced by governments and the public sector, there's a challenge to not argue for your policy and actually do a roadmap instead. We've definitely seen some of that in our review as well, that the roadmaps can be used to justify or argue for increased stringency or what it might be. I think it's a little bit harder for government representatives, especially with a limited mandate period, to stay neutral to policy questions. So we found that to be advantageous, coming from a practitioner's point of view. And of course, a government-authored report also has the challenge of coming up with concrete actions that the innovation actors can take. In the absence of having an institute like ours or a group of research institutions, or if it's an industry-focused roadmap, industry representatives, it's very difficult for a public sector produced roadmap to credibly assign actions to stakeholders, whereas we were primarily developing actions for ourselves to take while also looking at the system context. Another challenge that turned into a surprise benefit started from the challenge of drawing system boundaries. We had to sort of define subsectors, subsystems to do the roadmaps about, in order to delegate the very practical tasks of writing, collecting data. So we had a roadmap on power systems, and we had a roadmap on manufacturing, efficient manufacturing. These were crucial to get the work going in a practical sense, but innovation for sustainable development is actually very systemic, and when you get into the practice of it, the boundaries are very fluid. It's not clear at all which innovations belong to whom, and they don't follow the logic that you impose upon yourselves. That was challenging us in the beginning. It would have been great to say, okay, everybody do everything, but you can't really run a project that way. But in overcoming the challenge, we really got what I thought was the core benefit from the activity. We saw these synergies more clearly. Researchers who tend to work in a silo were forced to relate to other researchers' work, different innovations that they had perceived as maybe outside of their sector. And we created collaborations in practice. So, for example, there was some dispute as to how we would handle energy storage. Would it be in transport and mobility, in power, in buildings? Everybody thought it was relevant. We came up with inelegant solutions in the writing of the roadmaps. I think it was sloppily handled, actually, but in practice what happened was that the disparate institutes working on energy storage in those contexts, and also our Institute for Digital Technologies, got together and created an initiative internally to look at positive energy districts and microgrids, because they realized that it's ridiculous for us to be handling this separate from one another. And that's an initiative that's ongoing, and it came out of the roadmap. There may have been one or two other similar initiatives of that kind as well. I think more generally, the process forced these domain experts to look at the system level and to have a better understanding of system innovation. And I think that that's not a learning that was specific to our process, but is actually likely to arise from almost any road mapping process, as long as you can have interactions as part of it from the people providing content.
Thank you. So the RISE is basically the research institute, but you do have a kind of think tank activities.
So we have a very small part of our technology. We're a technical research institute. We have a very small part of the institute that does more think tank-like stuff. I belong to that part. But we try and take our engineers out of their comfort zones and do things like road mapping and these kinds of exercises.
You expect some outcomes regarding the policy making?
Oh, I see, we trade off, okay. In our roadmaps, we actually didn't develop policy recommendations per se with a recipient in mind. We provided a timeline with milestones that were descriptive, where we think the policy environment has to be in the future in order to facilitate a certain development. But we didn't have any targeted recommendations for policy. What we think we might be able to use the roadmaps for is influencing more innovation programming through Vinova and the different agencies. So we have a very well articulated view now that we can take to them. So.
Thank you. Any questions?
Thanks. Sorry if I missed this point. So you mentioned that you've done this roadmap on voluntarily, intentionally. It was an internal document, but what I want to then find out, is there another government plan, like a development plan that then outlines, for example, the energy mix of the future and by when they're phasing out? So what will then be the relationship with this roadmap, as well as then now the government plans, in whether it's a strategy or an act? You can use maybe the energy as an example.
So energy, there's very well established goals for sort of long-term outcomes for energy. So we have a national goal for independence from fossil fuels by 2030 in the transport sector, for example, and we have a national goal for 100% renewable energy in the power sector by 2045. So there are some goals. There are no roadmaps for those goals. So our roadmaps might help fill that gap. We are not out actively promoting them in that way. But I think that from an innovation perspective, they can help. But what our roadmaps didn't do was describe all the investments that have to be made that are sort of separate from innovation, sort of capital investments and things. That isn't really our area. If you were sitting next to Göran this morning when he was talking about how Vinnova does its planning in this bottom-up way, that it sort of opens up a topic and people send in their suggestions. So Vinnova won't be doing, for example, in innovation a roadmap, because that's not how they work. Well, maybe they'll surprise me, but that tends to be not how they work. But instead, we can come to them and propose an agenda in a certain area based on our own road mapping. So that's the burden, or the responsibility lies with us to a certain extent to use what we've produced in other contexts. Now, since that happened, the one thing that Sweden has done is initiate a massive road mapping process for decreasing emissions and fossil fuel use in energy, but we already heard all about that from Malin. So in the energy space, that's the biggest work going on in Sweden right now, the Fossil Free Sweden initiative.
Thank you very much.
If I may, so just a recommendation, when you make a question, please tell us who you are and briefly and where you work, so we know a bit of that also for not only for the discussion but also for the recording. Thank you.
Thank you. So we ask to hear to Mr. Jos Leijten about the Dutch experience with the STI policy roadmaps, please.
I will use this one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes. I already told people, I'm not sure if they're in the room, about sort of image that will not disappear when listening to you. I read on the newspaper this morning a short article dealing with culture and technology. And one of the arguments in the paper was a story about movies, futuristic movies that were made 30 years ago or so, early days of computing, etc. So the technology images were there more or less. And then the movies pictured offices of the future. And what was lacking in these images? Women. There were no women in offices of the future. Yeah? So this is the cultural aspect that we're dealing with somehow. And this is, of course, also going back to the complexities of road mapping. And I'm not considering myself as a road mapping expert, but I have a strong interest in the future. My subject, I might read it a little bit personal, and maybe sometimes also simplifying very complex things. So sorry about that. I studied and worked in urban and regional planning during the 70s. Yeah? And I was trained in a sort of goal-oriented setting in urban and regional planning at the time. And later on, I recognized the same kind of goal orientation in a large group of colleagues I worked with in TNO and later on here in Brussels in the Joint Institute. A large group of colleagues working on issues of environment and sustainable development. Yeah, and just as in urban development, the goal orientation could be characterized by a sequence of fashions. So it started with recycling, waste reduction, clean tech, then came bioeconomy, then came sustainable wind energy, electricity, as it is nowadays, and the fashion of today is, I think, it's circular. So what does it mean? After a certain period in working in urban and regional development, I moved on to innovation policy research. And then suddenly I realized I had to start thinking in terms of not goal orientation, but in terms of opportunities. because that's what innovation and innovation policy is about. And innovation policy wants to increase the range of opportunities, technological, but also socially, personally, maybe even. Yeah. So, in my memory, this field was sparkling around the 1990s. We worked on foresight, we worked on economics of technology, we worked on technology assessment, we worked on social and environmental impact assessment, clusters, the whole complexity of what was there. And following that kind of work during the 1990s, we developed within TNO a system of technology road mapping, first for internal strategic planning, and later on for also related to public research funding issues. So a very interesting period, and we used the time horizon usually well beyond the 4 years strategic planning, and included future-oriented analysis of the things that I already mentioned, interactions over time of science, technology, markets, behavior, social structures, and policies, including regulation. Yeah, so that was the sort of different layers of a very complex system and the interactions between them that set the scene at that time. And certainly in the first round of road mapping, this was the sort of dominant attitude at the time. So it was a way of really integrating things like the goal orientation that we've seen before and that our colleagues addressed in especially in their environmental work, and the opportunity thinking that was present in innovation policy thinking. And it also was a way of clearly anchoring the roadmaps in the relevant stakeholder groups. So looking at the present practices, yeah, and I'm not talking about some of the things that I heard today, but I'm talking about a couple of years ago, made a sort of very quick review of the roadmaps that were produced in the European public-private partnerships. And if you go through them, then you find an obligatory 1 page about the social environment, yeah, and you find maybe, if you're lucky, somewhat more about the market, but it's mostly about science and technology, and about expanding science and technology opportunities. And the same is true in the Netherlands. If you look at the roadmaps that are now produced, and it's a commonly used system in public research funding in the Netherlands, certainly if it comes to the public-private combined research funding, then you see similar things. So for instance, in the aerospace roadmap, you find targets as aerostructures, motor subsystems, components, future plane concepts, etc. So this is a technology roadmap, and it's about expanding technological capabilities, clearly. And this is the common approach that you find in high-tech sectors, technology-dominated sectors. But we also find the goal-oriented approach, of course. So the example of the geothermics roadmap. Yeah. But there again, and that comes close to your competitiveness drive, I think. The starting point is somehow to expand the use, referring in a couple of lines to the CO2 goals, etc. It comes to expanding the geothermal energy sector. So to reach this goal, a number of rather specific necessary innovations are defined in the roadmap. And they are grouped in things like exploration, in production, and in the use systems. So I was happy to see the use systems even mentioned there. So, but still, it was a sort of one-sided approach here. Who, in this sectoral approach, who takes care of the wider behavioral and social developments in the energy field, and even who takes care of the wider technological developments in the energy field? So it's not there in the roadmap, and there's no real overarching structure in which these things are done. So, in my view, what we need is to somehow unite this kind of opportunity-oriented thinking and the goal orientation. Yeah, as the goal orientation as it's driven by sustainable development goals. How can this look in practice? Well, certainly technologists are very good in funnel kind of thinking. Yeah, so it's the gradual narrowing, goal-oriented funnel which focuses on a number of technological and non-technological innovations toward a specific goal. But what we need is to combine this also with a second reversed funnel, which actually widens the scope in which we tend to analyze things, and we talk about new regulatory possibilities. We have to think about new cultural structures, social structures, etc., and think about widening technological opportunities. The combination of the two approaches might help us really step forward here, because it also forces us to be much more flexible in our road mapping thinking. So the goal orientation does right to the political goals that are laid down in these sustainable development goals, and the opportunities approach does right to the growing knowledge and understanding of the very complex interdependencies that we're talking about. It will not only make our roadmaps a lot better, taking these developments into account, but it may also lead to very easy structures of changing, adapting goals and targets during the trajectory. So to conclude, yeah, this kind of integrated approach is really necessary in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The combination of goal-oriented approach and opportunity or innovation driven approach important. That's also the message given by Takegami-san, previous speakers. Thank you very much. Any questions? Please.
Thank you very much. I would like to take an advantage of your long memory of the road mapping experience led by the European Commission and other member states since, as you said, probably early 90s. And I wonder, there was always a recognition that long-term thinking is important. This has driven this emphasis on foresight and a lot of foresight exercises. But then there was always this question: okay, aren't we taking it for granted, right? So there were also some critical voices. Yes, it's important to think about this, but do we actually know if it influences the way things happen? Is it really taken up? And I wonder if, from your memory of all the roadmaps that technology platforms have developed and the various joint program initiatives developed, are you actually able to trace some impact? Okay, maybe in an anecdotal way, but do you see actually impact of these initiatives? Maybe in terms of learning and so on.
Yeah, short-term impacts. Yeah. If you start talking to people, then you hear them telling about the short-term impacts of these things, but not so much about the longer-term impacts, because they've forgotten after 2 years. Yeah. So then you need again a new action, a new frame of thinking, and what's important is what I mentioned is the policy fashions, yeah, and how do we, yeah, we tended to accept them as a sort of, yeah, and sometimes even contributed to building these fashions ourselves.
So how do we go from quick fashion, that clearly dominates policy to slow fashion in policy? Your recommendations on this, because I think this is what we are trying to achieve here.
Yeah, again, develop this methodology further, of integrating the two approaches. We've had this innovation policy network called 6 Countries program, involving a lot more countries, doesn't matter, yeah, for more than 40 years now. And we're about to dissolve it. I already told a couple of people here. But this network had organized a lot of conferences on innovation policy, and it also organized a lot of conferences on environmental policies and environmental innovations, things like that, to different communities, always. Yeah, and that's what I try to argue here. If we really want to make a step forward, we need to integrate the two and do some good methodology work here, I guess.
Thank you very much for your insightful discussion.
Thank you.
Because of the time limitation, we have to move on to the next speaker. Thank you. Next, we'd like to hear from Norway, Mr. Gerrit Mulder, University of College of Southeast Norway, and NEDO-ESI, please.
Yes, the microphone.
Oh, yes.
So thank you, Jos, for an excellent introduction. I fully agree. I cannot agree more. I don't need to tell anything anymore. So I'm Gerrit Muller. Gerrit is a real Dutch name, so everybody is stumbling over it and even misspelling it. And I'm working in Norway. So I have 2 hats. I wear one hat as TNO hat, same hat as you, Jos has been have had for a long time. In Norway, I'm Professor Systems Engineering at the University of Southeastern Norway. Systems engineering is a discipline where you try to connect the technical world to the broad world. Yeah? So the depth and the breadth. So exactly the gap that you described, Jos, is what we try to teach to students, although I have to confess that most of our students work in very simple systems, just systems that get oil from subsea and so on. So not. Have to be made as well. Yes, yes. So let me tell you a little bit a trigger that I'm here. And one of the triggers is I'm living here. This is a town called Best, close to Eindhoven. We are at the moment in Brussels, so you know where we are. Here's this town. That's a town, 30,000 inhabitants, 12,000 houses, average income of 20,000 euros per year per inhabitant. So if you listen to this morning keynote, this is a very wealthy environment. Everybody has sanitation, everybody has water, everybody has a house, everybody is using a large amount of energy. Yeah. So that's the town, and in that town there is a corporation called Best Sustainable, and they advocate that we become sustainable and best. They have 340 members, and they promote sustainability. They act as a kind of intermediary, so and they act as a consultant towards the population in Best. And their ambition is to be energy neutral in 2030 and to have no waste at all in 2030. So that's the ambition. And the type of organization is, these are volunteers. And I have to tell you, I think 80% of them is 60 plus years old. Yeah, and mostly male and white. And and they work together in working groups, and there's a technology and education communication working group, and they mostly work bottom up. These people do good work. They help people to get solar panels, they help people to get heat pumps, they help people to understand what's ongoing, etc. So it's good work. But the problem is, if you now look at how many houses are close to energy neutral, then it is a very small fraction of these 12,000 houses. So now projects. Do we have a pen? Do we have a pen to write on that nice flip? No, a pen. No, nice flip. So just imagine we have to achieve 12,000 houses. In the past few years, we have tens of houses. Yeah. So what we have to do is an exponential growth in order to achieve that. And so how are we going to do that? And so one of the people from Duursam said, I think we need to make a decision in our organization. We need to start running projects, and we need to make more professional steps. And I proposed mid-September, let's make a roadmap for this cooperation. And 2 weeks later, Fernando mailed me and said, can you tell us something about sustainability roadmap? So, yeah, that's synchronicity, I would say. Huh? Good, so that's a little bit of the background. Just to give you a feeling, if you estimate what this means, 12,000 houses, making them energy neutral, my back of the envelope is 400 million euros does it cost. Yeah? So you also understand that there are a few things. If you have a volunteer organization and you talk 300 million euros, I think a volunteer organization shouldn't do 300 million euro type of projects. Yeah? So there is a competency issue, there's a governance issue, there's all kinds of issues. So who will be doing that? And what is then the role of Best Duursam? What's the role of the municipality? What's the role of the commercial parties? So plenty of questions. And if you also realize that most of these houses are built in a time that houses were not isolated, that means going energy neutral means you have to insulate, that you have to insulate a huge amount of houses, and they are barely insulatable. So what are we going to do? Are we going to break down all houses and rebuild them before 2030? So plenty of interesting challenges here. Yeah, good. Let's move to the other presentation. Quickly go through to the theory of road mapping. So what we have heard many times today is that typical people tend to make, next slide, yes, this slide. Many people tend to make either a roadmap that shows technology, so that is what do we need to build the solutions, or typically they make a roadmap of solutions. In a commercial world where I have worked, that means systems, the products. Yeah? It's either one of these two. And if you really want to get value of the roadmaps, you have to combine the goal and the means, but I extend it a little bit more. The first question you have to ask is, what is it that we need? And what is happening in that outside world? So if we have a fast-growing population, you have to realize that you have to anticipate on what the needs are of this fast-growing population, or a very young population, or a very old population. So this top layer of the roadmap is you need to understand what's happening, and what's happening for a large part determines what you need to do. Then the question is, if we know what we need to do, where we want to go, you have to determine how do we get there, and then you get the solutions. And if you have an idea about solutions, you have means for the solutions, and technology is one of the means. Most technologies are means. I can use heat pumps, solar, wind, and so on. But there are many more things you need. You also need the right competences, the right people, the right processes to do it. And then we also, governance very important. So the whole legislation, all the things that determine how you do it, you also have to determine. So there are many things that you have to do. And in road mapping, the trick is you have a few main questions. What is it that we want to do? Yeah. And then what can we do? And what will we do? Those are the three main questions. What do we want to do is the top part. What can we do is mostly the bottom part. And if you combine the two, you get to what will we do. So the priority question that you posed is inherent in building a roadmap, because you you come from two sides, and typically there's a tremendous struggle that you want all kinds of things, and that there are all kinds of constraints and opportunities that will force you to go in another direction, and you have to envision where do we want to go. So I fully agree that we have to combine the two, and I even brought it a little bit further. This integration of views, that is where the roadmap helps you to understand and helps you to go in the right direction. Next slide, and skip this one. Here, one back. Let's see, this one, yeah. And now, how does a good roadmap look like? And I advocate that while you make roadmaps, you should make a few diagrams that help you to think about things. I've seen several examples in the preview from the previous speakers. But in the end, for me, the roadmap is something that talks about today, near future, medium-term future, long-term future. And in fact, you would like to have one top-level roadmap as one slide, as one poster. That means you have to very, very much condense the information to have the main story and communicate the main story very clearly and communicate it. And of course, on one poster or one slide, it doesn't fit. So then we make a second layer and maybe make a third layer, and you don't go any further. So often what you see is that roadmaps become booklets. You see here booklets. I've seen much thicker books as roadmaps. And the problem is, then you already have hidden a lot of information. So I advocate that you even make them smaller than this thin booklet. Whew. Next slide, last slide. Then the roadmap, as I use it, is a tool to share a vision. So it is a shared envisioning of what the future can bring. And there's one certainty, it will not come true. So the world will change, but at least you have an idea together where the world will go to, and you use that idea to make together a kind of master plan for the near-term future, for the foreseeable future, where you have commitments, this is what we are going to do, and then all parties go and do their projects, and that is the chaotic reality. There are many projects. And one of the challenges is that the top part, the roadmap, is a sharing of a vision, but you shouldn't use it as a commitment. So if everybody has to sign it and say, this is what we will do, then everybody will reason from the defensive point of view, I need this and I need that, and then you have the wrong discussion. So you should delay the commitment to a later phase and have an open discussion. So, now
you make the complicated roadmap process very clearly, and we now understand how we approach the road mapping. So, any questions? Yes, please.
There's a microphone. Fully placed.
It was almost as a thought. No, I was thinking particularly on this thing. You know, when you make a master plan, it's normally wrong. You know, after a while, you figure out that we need to make changes and we need to update, etc. So, what kind of process do you propose to kind of do these continuous changes?
Yeah. So what happens in the commercial world? And now you have to realize the commercial world typically is a scale smaller than the scale that we discuss in sustainability. In the commercial world, you try to do that in a steady rhythm of about 3 months. Yeah, so you plan it and quarterly rolling forecast, they call it. I said in the commercial world, it's smaller. Yesterday I had a presentation by someone from the automotive industry, and they had workshops with 200 people sitting there. But in general, this kind of work is that you have to get the stakeholders together at some moment in time. You prepare it, you get the stakeholders together, and you come to a conclusion.
If you could tell us your name in general for the rest of the questions.
Yes, Roberto Zoboli from Catholic University of Milan and part of the inno4sd project. No, my question is about the conditions for stability and flexibility of road mapping and planning in general. I've heard the examples of Sweden, the Netherlands, Norway, relatively small northern countries. I am Italian. I belong to a framework and a culture in which every exercise in planning after 3 or 4 years becomes archaeology. So I'm very interested to better understand the condition for stability, in particular the reaction to external factors and the external shocks. And in particular, how your roadmap exercise can resist or can stay the same given a positive flexibility inside the road mapping itself, but it can resist to external shock. And what can be the factors that can allow you to go on with your road mapping? In particular, what can be the role of the private sector and the business sector in making, in grant this sort of stability and long-term commitment?
Yeah. But please be aware, I worked for 20 years in industry, so my experience is industry-based, healthcare systems, those kind of systems. So I don't claim that it will work in the governmental area where we often talk here about. One of the challenges is to make this one slide roadmap at a sufficient conceptual level and still make it concrete and specific. So the big risk is that it is a Mullerhood statement and it doesn't have value. So you look for really the crucial concepts and real crucial things that you want to show. That is very difficult. I've seen that many people making roadmaps are unable to make that step, and then you get a unstable roadmap because it's simply not the right information in it. So what you put in there that requires some real thinking, and then it will never be entirely stable, of course, because the external world is changing. So that's the reason that you once in a while you have to make an update. At the other hand, if you now look at the whole sustainability world, I read recently a paper 50 years ago, we had all the information about the climate problems, the coal dioxide, you name it, everything was 50 years ago already known. We know it now more accurate, but there is no real fundamental change between 50 years ago and now. Yeah? So the main concepts are still there. Yeah? And then, of course, there are technologies that pop up or don't make it. So there will be changes you have to adopt. But the main flow isn't that dynamic. The dynamics is often in all kinds of details, if you do it right.
To publish your practices in the future?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is I have now a Norwegian student that will help this Dutch cooperation, and if she does her work well, then it should also become a publication.
Yeah, we are looking forward to seeing that. Thank you very much. So the next speaker is Dr. Moinuddin. It's the interlinkage of the SDGs at national levels. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nakamura and Dr. Fernando. Hi, everybody. My name is Mustafa Moinuddin from the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in Japan. We call it IGS. IGS is a not-for-profit public interest foundation working mostly for the sustainable Asia and Pacific region. One of the main research focuses of our institute at the moment is the Sustainable Development Goals. And I would like to take this opportunity of this presentation today to talk about one specific area of SDGs that we are working, the SDG interlinkages analysis. Can you go to the next slide? As we already know, the SDGs are expected to be implemented in an integrated, holistic manner. But yesterday morning, many of the speakers have informed us that understanding how the SDGs interact with each other, how they're interlinked, is something that we still need to understand properly. We still need to explore. So, can you go to the previous slide? Sorry, yeah. So now we have 17 SDGs, 169 targets, and 232 or 244 if you look at the overlapped indicators. So how they link with each other, how they interact with each other is really a very complex thing, and this can be very daunting for policymakers to adopt an integrated approach. Because making progress in one SDG or one SDG target can have positive or negative impacts on the others, one or more, the so-called trade-offs and synergies and trade-offs. Now, in our institute, we have been thinking about this issue for quite some time now, and we developed a methodology as well as a tool that can help us identify the interlinkages among the SDG targets, also inform us about the nature of these interlinkages and how we can use this knowledge for effective policy making. Next slide, please. So here I'm trying to give you a very general overview of the methodological framework that we used to develop the SDG interlinkages tool. There are basically 4 steps, and the first step, we try to identify the causal links between all the 169 SDG target pairs. Okay, so for each of the SDG target pairs, we try to see whether there is a link between the two or not, yes or no. It's a kind of a binary link, 1 for if there is a link, 0 if there's none. For this, we relied on a very detailed review of literature, mainly from the IAG SDGs, consultation works, UNSDSN, UNSCAP, International Science Council, and so on. The next 2 slides provides a list of the literature that we reviewed to develop this causal links, for identifying these causal links. Second, we tried to identify the SDG indicators with trackable data for selected countries. Our tool covers 9 Asian countries from South, Southeast, and East Asia. You can see on the right side there's the list of the countries that are covered. So we have used the official SDG indicators list, that IAG SDG indicators list, 232 indicators, and then I try to identify whether we have the time series data for these indicators or not. And as you know that SDG data is not yet that available, but we try to collect time series data for these 9 countries mostly from the UNSD's Global Indicators database, as well as from the World Bank and some other sources. In some cases, we had to use proxy data. So what we try to do is, for each of the indicators, we try to each of the targets, we try to identify one representative indicator. Some of the targets have more than 1 indicators, but if, for the purpose of our tool, we're using 1 target, 1 indicator. And then, after we identified the indicators and collected the data, we conducted a statistical treatment to clean up the data as well as to fill up some missing blanks. And then we conducted correlation analysis based on this time series data for each of these countries. In the 4th step, we quantified the linkages between targets, for which we found that, yes, there is a link. Based on these 4 steps, we developed the IGS SDG interlinkages analysis and visualization tool, which is a web tool where you can, I will show you a bit later, you can actually see the interlinkages, see whether there's a link between 2 targets or not, whether you can see the direction of the links, you can see how strong they are, and you can see whether the links are positive or negative. We also developed a dashboard for each of the countries, and we produced some publications based on this. Can you go to the next slide, please? So here is a list of the references that we consulted to come up with the causal links, to identify the causal links among the SDG target pairs. Next, please. This is the continuation. And here is the snapshot of the web tool that we have. You can select the countries. We have two options here, actually. One is display. In the display option, you can explore one, two, or all of the SDG targets for one specific country. And see the interlinkages over here. When you see a black line, it means that there is a positive link between the two targets. If you have a red line, it means there is a negative link. And for each of the lines, you will see there is an arrow showing the direction of influence, meaning that, for example, from target 2.1 to target 3.4. So if the arrow goes from 2.1 to 3.4, it means achieving target 2.1 will have this kind of impact on target 3.4. The dotted line means that we know that there is a link between the two targets, but because of data unavailability, we could not identify the nature of the interlinkages. And if you put the cursor on the lines, you will see a number. This is the strength of the interlinkages, ranging from -1 to +1, -1 meaning strongly negative, +1 strongly positive. And you can choose, for each of the countries, you can choose for 1, 2, or all of the targets and see the interlinkages. There are several kinds of visualizations. One is this like default one, it's like a network. We can also have a matrix or grid view. Another option we have is a comparison where you can compare one target between 2 or more countries. So you can see how the countries differ according based on their socioeconomic stages of development. Next slide, please. As I said, that for each of the countries, we developed a dashboard indicating the links between the targets for the whole set of 169 targets. So here, it's a matrix actually, 169 by 169. The green ones indicate positive links between two targets. The red ones means negative links. We also have a more detailed one where we use dark green, dark red, light red to indicate strong positive, strong negative, weak positive, weak negative, as well as the strength, the exact number of the strength, ranging between -1 to +1. This is an example. Yeah, this is for Bangladesh, actually. Next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned that the previous one was for Bangladesh. I want to show you some of some examples of how we are applying this tool for effective policy making. In fact, we are in communication with the government of Bangladesh, the Prime Minister's Office of Bangladesh, which is the main SDG coordination body in the country. So the country has come up with a list of priority targets for priority targets, as well as kind of a mapping for the institutional arrangement, where if they identified line ministries and agencies for each of the targets. But what they did is based on their kind of in-house consultation, and they are unsure about their scientific or validity. So we are in consultation with the government. They want to use our tool to validate their findings and to convince the line ministries with this. So here you can see the top, they came up with some 30-something SDG targets as their priority, and they requested us to see whether they're valid or not. So we provided some additional recommendations to them as well. The top part actually shows the common targets that have been identified by both the Prime Minister's Office as well as from our analysis. On the left-hand side, on the bottom part, is the ones that were identified as a priority only by the government of Bangladesh. On the right-hand side, we also provided additional recommendations based on our own analysis. Okay, so this kind of a reconciled list over here. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay. So as I said, that the country has already made a very detailed map of institutions responsible for each of the SDG targets. Here we conducted a similar exercise. We provided some advice for the effective institutional arrangement focusing on target 6.2 on health and sanitation. This was actually requested by the government just before the HLPF. They wanted to know more about it. So we found, just like the previous slide, here the lead agency is the local government division. It's both the government and us, we think that this should be the one. And then on the top row, you see there's I use the short forms here. MOE means Ministry of Environment. Minister of Education. So these are the common ministries and agencies identified by both government of Bangladesh and us. And then we provided some additional recommendations as well on the bottom right side with the agencies and institutions that should be according to our interlinkages analysis are strongly linked with target 6.2 as well as some weak links. Could you go to the next slide, please? 2 minutes. Okay. Okay. So very quickly here, I'm trying to give you an example of how we identified the key indicators, key targets for Bangladesh. Okay, so we use various kind of centrality measures to identify, and then based on that, we use our own judgment. Here is a list of 15 targets. Next slide, please. A similar study is we have done for Indonesia, 15 targets. Actually, last week I was in Indonesia. Their planning commission is quite interested in our tool as they are preparing the SDG roadmap for the country. So they have one chapter on SDG interlinkages, and they will be using our the results of our analysis. Next slide, please. This is another ongoing study that we are doing at the moment. It's about the linkages between mitigation actions and SDGs. So you can see a comparison between two countries, Bangladesh and Japan, for NDCs related climate actions and SDGs. The country situations vary quite a lot, as you can see over here. But this is based on the data from Climate Watch. And then we used our SDG interlinkage analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, here is the example of, again, for Bangladesh. On the left-hand side is, we call it out-degree linkages. So for NDC actions, we try to identify how these the targets that are related to the SDG actions will have effect on other ones. The first one is positive, second one is negative. Next, on the right side is in-degree linkages, meaning how these targets that have been identified to be linked with NDCs will be affected by other targets. Next slide, please. We did a similar study for Japan. If you see the two slides side by side, you will see the differences between the country realities. Next, please. Last but not least, here is an example of how we can use the tool for policy making. First is planning in terms of priority setting and for SDG integration. Second is institutional arrangements, as we did for Bangladesh. Third is financial arrangement. We haven't yet done it, but we're going to conduct a study on this. And then fourth is monitoring and reporting, monitoring the progress of SDG implementation and reporting. We also can develop some, we call them headline indicators to capture the whole picture of the SDGs. Okay, last slide. So here you can actually consult our website, download the related reports and other publications, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very impressed with that they developed the tools and use them for consultation with 9 countries?
9 Asian countries.
9 Asian countries. That's good.
For the moment, but we are expanding.
Yes, and also the tools are free, for free.
Yes.
So you can use them and download by downloading. Any question, please?
I'm not an econometrician, but I was surprised at the use of the word causality.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you call it an associated relationship? Because it was something. You could have X, which is a function of A, B, C, D, E.
Yes.
And so to use the word causality all the time, I was a bit surprised.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the question. Yes, there are 169 targets, and one target can be influenced by many others, right? So there could be some indirect links as well. But in our tool, we looked into direct links between the targets. So if we conduct only correlation, then we do not have the causality. So at first, we used literature review to come up with whether there is a causal link between two targets or not. A direct link only, not the indirect ones. So, and after that, we use the correlation analysis to see how strong these links are. And the correlation is only for the ones where we found causal links. Yes. Okay. Yes.
If I may, I have a practical question. I'm fascinated by the exercise, by the approach and the methodology. And I wonder, in light of the discussions today, that we are discussing long-term tools for deploying and eventually, helping national, subnational levels to implement SDGs. Where would you place this tool in the context of a roadmap exercise? In the baseline assessment, in the analysis, or some sort of linkages to monitoring? Is there anywhere, although it's not explicit in the presentation, maybe you may want to elaborate?
Okay. Thank you very much for your question. As I shown in the very last slide, it can actually help at various stages of SDG implementation, starting from planning as well as going all the details up to the monitoring. So which means that it should be we can conduct this analysis from time to time to see how the changes are taking place. And this will also help us make a reprioritization. Because as the countries make the progress, we can use this one to find out how the changes have taken place and whether we need to make a different list of prioritization. We call it just kind of progressive or staged prioritization. So I think it can be in the STI or SDG roadmap, it can actually play a role at various stages in understanding. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We are going to have the last presentation by Mr. Michal Miedzinski, a kind of a summary presentation, I hope.
We're going to do that one because the energy is going away. We'll do some dancing moves. No, we practiced a lot.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And we don't have loads of time. There was a couple of idiots down here kept asking questions. So Michal and I are going to talk about some of the work we've been doing in the inno4sd project, about providing guidelines for STI road mapping initiatives to support the SDGs. Next slide, please. So we've got a pretty simple overview. First of all, I'm going to say a brief word about roadmaps and their role in innovation governance, which touches on and links to quite a lot of things that have been said already, but I think it's worth saying. Michal is then going to talk about the review of a whole bunch of STI policy roadmaps that we did. And then I'm going to talk about some of the ideas that are emerging from a kind of guidelines perspective. So next slide, please. Okay, so I think roadmaps can be used for an awful lot of things. I come at things from a kind of public policy perspective rather than, we've heard a lot about their use in business, but I come from a public policy perspective and thinking about the governance of innovation policy and the governance of technology policy. So I think roadmaps play a kind of an interesting and perhaps unexplored role in this area. Roadmapping processes are really useful for informing decisions. So that's both, you do the analysis and that helps people make actual specific decisions, but the whole process also provides a more generic awareness and understanding of stakeholder needs, agendas, opportunities, etc. So it helps to inform decisions. But they also are a vehicle for expressing and delivering decisions that have already been made and for actually implementing policy goals. And Maria Luisa's gone, but earlier on she said, what changed after you did the roadmap? It's nice to have reports. We all like reports and we like kind of getting together at conferences and workshops and things. But the question is, what's changed? And one of the ways that roadmaps actually deliver, and road mapping processes deliver change, is by fostering shared expectations, shared beliefs about what will happen. And we know from sociological studies of innovation and technological change that when people share expectations, that has an effect. So that's both micro expectations in terms of specific technological developments and targets. So when people in a heterogeneous network of actors share beliefs about the future development of specific components or specific technological objects, then that helps organize and align innovation activities in that area. And also macro expectations at the level of broad visions and prospects for particular areas of technology. When lots of people start to believe that a particular area of technology has a future, they start to invest in it, and that has an effect. So fostering shared expectations can facilitate legitimacy, it can attract resources, and it can align actors. So it can have real substantive impact on its own. So roadmaps are about informing decisions. They are also about delivering the outcomes from those decisions. But of course, they only do all of that if they are credible, so if they are based on sound analysis, and if they have the support of key actors. And we should be really careful not to overstate the importance of road mapping and roadmaps, because they are often sometimes they're used as excuses for inaction. You know, a government ministry decides, well, we'll do a roadmap about this problem, and then we don't actually have to implement any policy because we can point to our glorious roadmap. Yeah, okay, so I think I'll leave that there, but that perspective has some implications for the way that we think about what roadmaps are for and how they should be done. Next slide, please. Right, so I'm going to hand over to Michal now to talk about our review.
Right, so why review? We noticed that this growing interest in road mapping technique emerging also in the public sector. And this has been reinforced also in the context of STI forum on the level of, in the UN discussions. So there is clear an expectation that road mapping, well, as a tool, as an approach, can help public policies. So we decided to look at existing roadmaps that either come from public sector or actively engage the perspective of public sector, because, well, what you've heard before from other speakers, when you really look for literature on roadmap, well, this comes from its management technique. It's used in companies, typically a company. Now, more recently, there was the exercises on the sector level, some multi-stakeholder initiatives, but rarely, if ever, policy is the starting point. Policy often is something outside. I mean, something you comply with or complain or express expectations, but it's not something which you're actually working on. So we wanted to see, is this really the case? So what we've done, I mean, just a preview. There is an outlook we prepared. It's finished. It hasn't been printed in the glossy covers, but for those who are interested, we are very happy to just pass it on in PDF form. So if you're interested, please just give us your email address. We'll send it to you and so on. So what we've done, we looked at 20 roadmaps from around the world, and just to be really honest, so we did intend to cover countries of very different contexts, developing countries especially, developed countries as well, but obviously then realized, unsurprisingly, that the experience of road mapping in government in relation to sustainable development that takes innovation at its core is rather limited. There's not that many things. I mean, a lot of people talk about this, then you look for actual exercises and you struggle. Anyway, so we've reviewed 20 roadmaps, including some Nordic experience, but also some experiences in Africa and Asia, country-level experiences, international experiences. You can see it in the paper. Well, so what we found is that, as Will already said, not that unsurprisingly, is that the word roadmap is used in a very liberal way. It's not that you read, let's say, Rob Fowles papers, and then you go to read the government various roadmaps, and you see the same visualizations coming on and on. No, not at all. So some documents that are called roadmaps, they have very little to do what you would expect from a road mapping document. Some indeed follow the methodology almost religiously. Huge diversity in terms of their objectives and obviously context in which they are developed, political embeddedness and so on. But we, just to give you an idea, in these 20 roadmaps, we found that their objectives ranged from building visions. It included exploration of various plausible pathways, technology pathways, technology advocacy, you know, and they are really used to actually push agendas, stakeholder alignment, support for policy design, and finally, a straightforward use of support for implementation. And these are not exclusive goals. So we noticed that roadmaps can cover very different elements of all this journey. They can focus on the very early stages, vision. They can go all the way just to implement, to help, really as a planning tool, or they can stretch. Right. However, just not to be too long, it's an exciting topic, you know. I mean, as you noticed, we talk too much in general, but there are lots of weaknesses. If we really are to look at roadmaps as a tool or policy instrument to help in the context of SDGs, then we have to be extremely careful, because there's not that many experiences that made us, you know, shout, "Eureka! This is it! You know, this is the approach to use." They were missing lots of core elements, we thought, and it doesn't mean, you know, we don't mean to be too critical. They miss a lot of elements, sometimes because of the political reality, sometimes because of resources available, you know, so they are really context-dependent beasts. Next, please. So this is just, well, obviously not say, this is the 20 that we reviewed. We developed a certain methodology to follow it down. Everything's in the paper. Right, and now what we do. So in this project we've had this review. There will be a paper. This paper exists, and we are in the process. And this is part of this process, in a way. We are preparing guidelines, and the idea is, well, the experience we saw from the World Business Council is inspiring, especially that their guidelines are very short and concise. So this is definitely what we'll take from our colleagues there. We're aiming at producing something concise and relatively easy to follow, based on existing approaches and also lessons shared today.
Great. Okay, thanks, Michal. Next slide, please. Okay, so we had a look at existing guidelines on how to do road mapping, much of which is developed for the classic technology road mapping arena, whether it's developed by governments or government agencies for use in the public sector, or whether it's for use in businesses. So there's quite a lot of guidance that's rooted on core technology road mapping. There's a few nice examples of broader, what one might call STI policy road mapping guidance, like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. One of the things we noticed, though, about that guidance is that it doesn't it's typically developed for a specific context. So like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development guidance is focused on sector roadmaps for the SDGs. So it has a specific context, which is obviously helpful. What we think there's a kind of a missing area for is some guidance on how to tailor road mapping processes to different contexts. So that's the bit that we're going to present a bit today. And we're going to do that through talking about 4 kind of core strategic context questions that roadmaps should be dealing with. Next slide, please. So the first is about the kind of scope and specificity. So we've got a kind of a hierarchy of levels of detail, and we've sort of seen variations of this thinking actually throughout the presentations today, where you've got classic kind of technology road mapping at the bottom, where it's a very strongly techno-economic focus, components, technological systems. We can scale that up a bit to whether it's specific challenges, missions perhaps, or technological opportunity areas, like the emergence of graphene or whatever, or nanotechnology, where one broadens out the techno-economic detail into a broader socio-technical kind of frame, taking into account broader societal issues, etc. And then we can go all the way up to STI policy as a whole, where we're really operating at the level of governance and strategy. And of course, as you go further up that breadth, you lose technological detail, or at least if you try to have technological detail, you've got an awful lot of individual underpinning technology roadmaps. And you have an increasing emphasis on governance aspects that are less rooted in material realities and relationships, and which arguably are less durable, less predictable and durable. So obviously there are lots of things that are deeply unpredictable about technological systems, but there are also lots of things that are pretty locked in. The world of policy and governance can be rather more fluid. And that poses challenges for our ability to think and structure convincing and compelling narratives over time with clear milestones from a policy and governance perspective. So clearly where one is on this hierarchy plays a big role in the nature of the process and the aspirations for it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that we noticed with the roadmaps that we reviewed and that has been confirmed by what we've heard today is that any roadmap contains three kind of core elements. It's got the where are we now bit, but that's not up here. It's got the where do we want to be, which is some kind of vision or target, right? That's the top of this triangle. It's then got a pathway, how do we get there, or how could one get there? That's the pathway element. And then it's got the planning element, who needs to do what, when, right? So we've got these three components of roadmaps, but actually different roadmaps give those very different emphases. And so we've kind of mapped a few of those roadmaps across those different dimensions of how the future is thought about. And so we heard earlier on from the Swedish fossil-free Sweden initiative that the targets were uncontentious, that the targets were kind of a given, and so there was much less need to spend time working out what the targets were because they were given. You could spend a lot more time on the pathway and the planning elements. In less mature debates, and I think somebody else, and I think Jesse, was it you were saying in some of the experiences where there wasn't a given target, actually a lot more work had to go into that visioning process, getting buy-in, agreeing where we needed to be. And clearly where one is in that context is going to depend a lot on the goals of the process, the context in which it's rooted, and that's going to influence the structure of the road mapping process and the kinds of activities that can be envisaged. Next slide, please.
And very quickly, if I may, this really resonates with Jos's point, I think, that there's this tension, with goal orientation and opportunity and exploration, except we also added this notion of pathway, which was the one that was most absent, I think. So this is when that's why we'll ask the question about the narrative of change. We're looking forward how the narrative of change or the theory of change is explained in the roadmap. So not just a picture from there to there or targets, milestones, but actually the logic, the narrative. Like what is the assumption about causalities that the roadmaps are rooted in, and this we haven't seen much, to be honest.
Okay, right. So we've our first two kind of strategic questions were, what is the scope, whole broad policy level down to a specific technology arena. The second one was kind of how you're going to describe the future. The third one is around the actor and governance contexts, and obviously these can be hugely diverse, but we think there are some kind of broadly archetypal situations in which roadmaps get developed, and we're still kind of working this out, but three kind of archetypal situations that we've encountered quite a lot. First, one in which there is a specific lead organization which is developing and implementing some kind of strategic action program. So that's pretty common, whether it's a government department or it's a company, and it has the power to implement a whole set of actions, and it is using the road mapping process, first of all, to do horizon scanning, work out what the uncertainties are, set out a clear plan of action, and often using the road mapping process to communicate that plan to others and to secure kind of agreement and buy-in within the organization. We've then got a second one where you have, rather than it being a single organization, you've got a joint initiative of empowered actors. So actors who are coming together to create a jointly agreed view across a number of organizations in a context in which each of them are willing to take specific identified roles, make commitments, etc. And there clearly, there's a strong role for alignment, for bringing people together, etc. And you can see actually there's a kind of hybrid in between those where you've got a strong lead who's trying to bring along a whole broader array of stakeholders who may be more or less keen on being brought along. That's often what happens with a government-initiated roadmap process. And then finally, you've got roadmaps that are initiated by relatively weak actors who are seeking to enroll others in the change that they envisage. And so I used to work a lot on hydrogen energy. And in the UK, we have a relatively weak hydrogen and fuel cell sector with a few really great firms, but not super strong. And the UK hydrogen and fuel cell community, over the last 15 years, keep on getting together and developing a roadmap. And then they take it to the government and say, here is our roadmap. And government says, that's really nice, well done. And not a lot happens. And although it's rooted in the community of relevant actors, they don't have the strength to carry it out, and they are aiming to use the roadmap as an advocacy tool. And we see that with both relatively weak and sometimes with relatively strong actors, but as a mechanism for trying to enroll actors. Now, clearly, if you're down at that end, relatively weak actors trying to initiate change, you can't be in the planning corner of the triangle, right? So these things interact a bit. Okay, the final of the strategic questions is around this issue of diversity, pluralism, and uncertainty. I was pleased, Roberto, that you raised the question of uncertainty and how we deal with it, because clearly any planning initiative faces great uncertainty about what is possible, but it also faces diverse perspectives on what is desirable. And a roadmap involves setting out a desired future state. It was quite interesting, I think it was the World Business Council Sustainable Development, the chemical sector roadmap. The chemical sector wanted that to be their voice. They didn't want it to be the position of a diverse array of stakeholders. It was going to be the chemical sector voice. And from a public policy perspective, that's very useful. But if you're developing policy roadmaps, there is a duty to, as with SDG target 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making. So that means, that begs questions about who gets to be involved in deciding what is desirable, and whose ideas and thoughts and beliefs get represented in thinking about what is possible. And of course, all of that happens in a context in which change necessarily leads to losers as well as winners. So how road mapping processes initiated by governments engage with that question of participation, of diverse views about which way to go, and how to deal with losers is I think, a really difficult one that tends to get neglected in the sort of road mapping literature. Next slide, please. I wrote a paper on this ages ago, so I'm just going to reuse the same phrase from the road mapping paper I wrote, which is that I think road mappers in this context face a dilemma that on the one hand, if you've got a very clear prescriptive roadmap based on the consensus of a powerful set of incumbent actors, that's going to have most influence. It's most credible by virtue of the power of the actors vested in it, and it's, do I need to finish? Yeah. Okay, right, I'll speed up. But it ignores marginal perspectives, right? So that creates a problem, and the responses are that we need to think about multiple possible pathways. We need to think about more explicit attention to experimentation and decision points and adaptive learning. And we need to think about how in road mapping processes in public policy contexts we can make space for representing alternative perspectives, marginal voices, excluded groups, etc. And that's the end.
Thank you very much. Great. Thank you very much to our colleagues from University College London. We can take two very, very short questions, and then we, unfortunately, because of the timing, we will not have a discussion and a wrapping session because you have already expressed lots of questions. But if we could have a couple very brief questions/statements for our colleagues, and then with that we would just proceed to some final messages from our side. Thank you. Questions?
Yes. If you don't have questions, you can ask questions to one.
Yes. Is the compact, concise guideline included in PDF?
Not yet.
Not yet. When will it come?
It will come by January, hopefully by the end of the year.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you.
It will be obviously on the website.
My name is Margaret Colley, and I work at the United Nations University. Just to comment and say, great job for taking this bold step and for sharing this initial steps on, that on the work that you're doing. Kudos. And just if you could share, who do you foresee to be the first uptakers of the work of the work that you're producing in the future once you have, more further results?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because this is the question we are reminding ourselves constantly. You see, so I mean, to be the very honest answer one is, this is part of the project, so we are doing what we're supposed to do, but we are also very fortunate and lucky that this seems to be a very, very timely moment for this sort of reflection. So this will be we are in touch with the JIST and also the process within technology facilitation mechanism that looks specifically at STI for SDGs roadmaps. So we are feeding into this process informally and formally, so it will be taken up on this level. And of course we are looking around and really happy to exchange experiences around. And by the way, Jesse is also one of the authors. So he's a practitioner, and I know that, Jesse, I mean, you said that it was already useful in a way in the work.
Yeah, I mean, we're trying to sort of bring things together, and as part of this, I used the excuse of this analysis to ask Malin and Fossil Free Sweden if I could interview their roadmap practitioners for the different industries and try and see which of these lessons they may have already taken on board and which they haven't. So we're trying to bring threads together as best we can, but yeah.
With that last comment, we would really like to thank all of the distinguished speakers and participants. So I would like to suggest a big round of applause to everybody, all of you, for having contributed. We would like to thank Dr. Nakamura and his team for the leadership and all of the hard work and the follow-up work that it will be carried out, because they have a very important mission leading the effort at UN in the topic of roadmaps, and I have obviously we need to conclude. Today what we have done is basically ask many of you on the different perspectives, why it started, how it started, what are your takes on this. But the real challenge comes next, and if all of these experiences can be translated into guidelines and how we move into action. So this is an invitation to all of you from your organization, from your own personal perspective, that you've seen a number of efforts nationwide, city level, sector level, public policy, more business oriented, and it serves as an inspiration, but it loses sense if it's not actionable into solutions that we need for the SDGs. So we are more than happy to continue the discussion tomorrow and in coming weeks and in coming months. And this is an invitation and a reflection for you all. We thank you for your participation. Thank you, Dr. Nakamura.
Thank you.
And practical message for all of you. Now we do not go back to the main room, because that's the indication we received from timekeeping and all that. Dinner has been moved at 9 p.m. It'll start at 9 p.m. I know it's very challenging, but we will meet at 8:45. We have instructed the restaurant to be as fast and efficient as possible. We didn't have anything to do with it, but it has been moved at 9. It's also in the city center. The information is in your booklet, and then those of you who are at the hotel from the speakers, we will leave at 8:20 just to go with enough time just to go to the restaurant. Thank you very much.
Thank you.